We've covered the topic of pseudotumors and artifacts. Next on our list are true masses. Now, true masses could either be a thrombus, a benign tumor, a malignant tumor, and a malignant tumor could again be either primary or secondary. In this section, we'll focus on the thrombus. Where would you find a thrombus in the heart? Well, you can find it practically anywhere. In the left ventricle, in the left atrium, in the right atrium, and in the right ventricle, but also in the IVC or SVC. But the most common location is definitely the left atrium, here the left atrial appendage, or the left ventricle. Other locations where you relatively frequently see thrombi would be the prosthetic valves and the aorta. Where don't you find thrombi? You don't find them on the valves. Why not? Because the valves move, and thrombi usually don't form on structures which move very rapidly. There are just two exceptions. One exception is the situation where you have endocarditis, because endocarditis is actually a superinfected thrombus. And in patients, for example, who are on assist devices where the valves don't open or open only occasionally, in such a situation, thrombus can form, especially if left ventricle function is very poor. So in assist devices, there would be a rare occasion where you would find a thrombus on the valves. If you think of when a thrombus forms, it's easy to understand if you just look at two factors which contribute to thrombus formation. The one is the speed with which blood flows, because the slower blood flows, the more likely it is that the erythrocytes and the thrombogenetic material organizes. And the second thing you need for thrombus formation in most instances is a thrombogenic surface. And that kind of explains the predisposing factors very nicely. Namely, you need the thrombogenic surface. For example, if you have a lesion, for example, a jet lesion or maybe an infarct, you need slow flow, for example, poor left ventricle function, or in the atria, atrial fibrillation. And this is very nicely exemplified in this echo here. This is a beautiful example where you have many of the factors that I talked about in one image. It's a patient who received a mitral annuloplasty where the ring was actually relatively small, and therefore there's some degree of obstruction. Now, this leads to the problem that we have slow flow in the left atrium, and this spontaneous contrast that you see right here is more or less a predisposing factor for thrombus formation. In addition, you have a large left atrium, which also predisposes to slow flow. You have a reduction in left ventricle function, and furthermore, the patient also has atrial fibrillation. So this is the kind of patient where I would be really worried that he might develop a thrombus. But again, the two key factors for the development of a thrombus are slow flow and a thrombogenic surface. Now let's take a look at left ventricular thrombi, which are usually located in the apex. I want you to tell me which of these four examples is a patient that does not have a thrombus. Take a look. Look at the region, the apex, where you usually find a thrombus, and see for yourself. Okay, I'll just give you a second or so. I guess it's quite apparent. The patient here on the bottom right is the one that does not have a thrombus. Let's look more closely. Here we have a patient that definitely has a mass, a thrombus which is partially detached from the interventricular septum. Look, there is a regional wall motion abnormality in the apex. Thrombus following anterior myocardial infarction. What about this patient here? Again, a mass, a thrombus, in conjunction with a wall motion abnormality of the distal septum. This thrombus extends down towards the IVS. This patient here, look, the apical region is dilated and we have a mass inside here. This is a thrombus too, but not in a patient with myocardial infarction, but it's in a patient who had a Takotsubo syndrome, a broken heart disease. You've learned about that pathology in the previous chapters. This is the only patient where we don't see a thrombus. The only thing that might lead us into believing there is one is this trabeculation here. But There is also no wall motion abnormality, so I would be pretty sure that this patient does not have a thrombus. But what about this patient here? Well, very difficult to say. First of all, he has a dilated left ventricle, which would predispose him to developing a thrombus. And the apex is akinetic as well. And then we have all these echogenic substances here, or parts here. Well, anyway, I don't think that I can tell from this image alone. I will show you later how I would solve this case. Before I do so, let's turn to the next patient. Here, in this case, I think it's also quite clear. This must be a thrombus. Take a look. You have echogenic areas and more echolucent areas. This is something you see quite frequently in thrombi. It means that parts of the thrombus are forming or dissolving, while others are starting to organize or are more dense. In any case, very frequently you will see a little bit of a different echogenicity between the thrombus and the myocardium. What about this structure here? Now, this is a thrombus as well in a patient with a very small supraapical aneurysm. We talked about that in the chapter on myocardial infarction. Even small aneurysms can develop a thrombus. And to visualize such thrombi, you need to use atypical views. And this is such an atypical view. But I think it's quite clear this cannot be an artifact. This must be a thrombus. It might be more difficult in this patient, but even more. You still have a patient that has an abnormal shape of the cavity simply because part of this apical region is filled with a thrombus. So again, I would be quite certain that this is a thrombus, also because, again, there is a regional wall motion abnormality at the apex, an apical infarct. But if you want to be 100% sure in this case, all you need to do is give him contrast. The type of contrast we give is a so-called left ventricular contrast, which passes through the pulmonary circulation, where the bubbles are so small that they go through the capillaries and thereby reach the cavity of the left ventricle, and thereby you have a very nice sparing defect exactly where the thrombus is. So the thrombus is dark here and the contrast is light, and that helps us to discern the thrombus from, I would say, an artifact. And now we come back to the case I showed you previously. Remember the patient where we were not certain? Well, this is exactly what I do in this patient as well. Here is the contrast study and no thrombus. We have no sparing defect and everything seems to be okay. So even though there are predisposing factors in this patient, the patient does not have a thrombus. Now, alternatively, one can also use color and plug down the PRF frequency right here. However, in most cases, this does not really help you as much as contrast. So I would prefer to use contrast, especially if you have it. Not everything that appears like a thrombus is really a thrombus. You see, there is a mass here that coats the apex of the ventricle here, but there's something different compared to the cases I showed you previously. Here we have a rather hyperdynamic left ventricle, and we have no wall motion abnormality. What does that mean? Well, it means that the likelihood is very low that this is a thrombus. What we have here is a patient who has endomyocardial fibrosis. And the structure we see here is the eosinophilic infiltrate that is filling out the apex, a typical pathology that you already met in the chapter on restrictive cardiomyopathy. Here are other views showing the same patient. Right here we have this infiltrate here, and also here, filling out the entire apex. Again, the ventricle is hyperdynamic and there is no wall motion abnormality. What about this patient here? Well, at the first sight, it looks like this patient has an awkward kind of a trabeculation that spans the left ventricle here. But in reality, this is a thrombus with a central area that was beginning to dissolve, liquidified. Why do I think this is the case? Well, again, because the patient has a wall motion abnormality there. And because we followed up the patient, we saw that this actually resolved after some time. Very important, if you diagnose a thrombus, is not only to say whether or not a thrombus is present and how large it is, but you should also look at whether or not the patient has a rather fresh or an old thrombus. How can you tell? Well, the more organized it is, the older it is, the more echogenic it actually is. If it has very translucent areas like this one here, it means it's rather fresh, and the likelihood of dissolving it is also higher. Probably also the likelihood of it embolizing. Another example, here is a patient where we see the thrombus right here. You see it's very echolucent and it's kind of hidden within the trabecula. Very difficult to diagnose a patient who had acute myocarditis, and if you look exactly, there is a central echolucent area, and it's like a capsule around this thrombus, and it's very jelly-like. So again, probably a very fresh thrombus, which is very mobile and has a high likelihood of embolizing. This is a very mobile thrombus. You can almost appreciate that part of it has actually dislodged here from the interventricular septum. This was kind of stuck probably in here, and now it kind of is starting to release itself. Very scary echo, I would say. So when you have these thrombi, important to also follow these thrombi along and compare it with the previous exam so that the referral doctor also knows what the change in the structure of the thrombus is. Does it get smaller? Does it start to dissolve? Is it now less mobile? All these factors are very important for decision making. Let's summarize. Take a look whether or not the thrombus is old or fresh, mobile or sessile, small or large, and always differentiate thrombus from artifacts or trabecula. Look whether or not the patient has a myocardial scar or especially an acute myocardial infarction with a thrombogenic surface. Patients with poor left ventricular function have a higher likelihood for thrombus formation, and rarely you would find a tumor in the apex of the ventricle. And finally, differentiate thrombi from endomyocardial fibrosis. Next on our list is the thrombus in the right ventricle, which you will rarely see. I'll show you some of the few examples that I have in my database. Here is a patient where you can see a thrombus right here in the right ventricle. He also has a pacemaker. Those are the artifacts here. And why does this patient actually have a thrombus in the right heart? Again, for the same reason you develop one in the left heart, because ventricular function, right ventricular function, is very poor. Look at the ventricle right here. It's almost not moving at all. And here again is the thrombus. As a matter of fact, the patient also had left ventricular dysfunction, so biventricular heart failure. Here's another example, again, of a patient who had biventricular failure. This time we have a thrombus in the left heart, a very large thrombus, with a highly mobile portion right here. And in addition, there's a mobile thrombus in the right ventricle. Again, because right ventricular function is poor. So you rarely find a thrombus in the right ventricle in normal right ventricular function. Where else can you find a thrombus? We've seen this image before. This is an atypical two-chamber view, I would say, where we can see not only the ridge, the limbus between the left atrial appendage and the pulmonary vein, but also a thrombus right here in the left atrial appendage. So on certain occasions, you might also detect a thrombus in the left atrial appendage from a transthoracic approach. Again, why does the patient have a thrombus? Poor left ventricular function, atrial fibrillation, a large atrium, all of the factors that we've heard so many times before. And here is an example of a pathology that I've seen actually several times. Again, a thrombus in the left atrium, but if you look closely, you can see that it arises from the left atrial appendage and kind of points towards the mitral valve right here and almost protrudes into the left ventricle. So a highly mobile, very large thrombus of the left atrial appendage. We've seen a thrombus in the left ventricle, in the left atrium, and the right ventricle. The only chamber that is still missing is the right atrium. And here you have it. This is the thrombus in the right atrium. A very large thrombus, but this patient also has a thrombus in the left atrium. So we assume that this patient had some predisposition for developing a thrombus. Nevertheless, this is a patient who had restrictive cardiomyopathy. You see very large atria and poor left ventricular function, and probably also reduced right ventricular function. All of these in addition predisposed to thrombus formation. Okay, I think you've seen enough thrombi. In the next section, we'll deal with benign masses.